From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
One tax to charge them all. But is it a fair tax? That's where the argument ensues. Plus, renewed efforts to limit or even outlaw abortions in Kansas. Will they make headway? But first,
all units are out to a possible shooting.
A series of swatting calls hits more than a dozen Kansas high schools, even after the state made swatting a felony. What more can be done? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. This is Pilar Pedraza with Kansas Week. Swatting calls. That's when somebody calls the police saying an active shooter or some other violent crime is going on in order to get the police to show up at a specific location. In this case, the KBI says 17 school districts targeted in one day.
All units are out to a possible shooting at Free State High School.
Scenes like this from a Lawrence police officer's body cam repeated over and over again Wednesday morning as law enforcement scrambled to save lives.
Officers arrived, we cleared the building.
Lives that were never in any actual danger.
Through the search of the high school, we received information through an outside source that this was possibly a hoax.
Police say it all started at Wichita North High shortly before 8 a.m. Then came 9 more calls, 9 more high schools from Liberal to Lawrence, El Dorado to Colby, all under lockdown as teachers, staff, and students wondered what was going on.
I was a little shocked, but I was just trying to make sure my friends and family were okay.
Then we saw policemen walk by with their guns, so we kind of knew what was kind of happening. So we got in a little shelter in place.
Students we spoke with expressing shock, fear, and anger when they found out it was all because someone called in a false report. The National Association of School Resource Officers says swatting calls have targeted dozens of schools in at least 39 states, 40 including Kansas on Wednesday.
I think it's really childish.
We hope that it never happens again, but we know it will happen again. That's not something to mess around with. It was a fake call, but still, that's not that funny to do because you put a bunch of kids in danger.
Now, the KBI says it is trying to track down the folks who are behind these calls. Kansas lawmakers have toughened the law on swatting in recent years. But is it enough? Here to answer that and many other questions, we have with us Representative Jason Probst, a Democrat from Hutchinson, and State Representative Leah Howell, a Republican from Derby. Thank you both so much for being here. And Jason, I'm trying to remember, you were in the State House, in the legislature when they made these changes, weren't you?
That's right.
Yeah, so I mean, we toughened the law, stricter penalties, made certain calls a felony, and yet it doesn't seem to have done any good.
Well, and maybe we ought to look at, if you're targeting a school, creating another level, with the increased penalty on that. I can't imagine what would compel someone to call in a swatting call to a school in this environment where you're putting police in danger, children in danger. It's such a massive scale. I don't know what the answer might be at this point, but I think most of us in the legislature would do everything we could to bring an end to that.
And Leah, before the show, you and I were talking about both being mothers of boys. And, when we're talking about teenagers, not always the clearest on making decisions. When we were kids, there was the old pull the fire alarm thing. It feels like this has kind of become the next level, but with modern technology, Google-induced phone numbers, that sort of thing, they're able to just do so much more.
Right. Well, and as I recall, I know in at least some swatting cases here in Sedgwick County, some of these are coming from out of state even. Mm-hmm. And so it is really heartbreaking that people think this is apparently entertaining or even just okay to do, because obviously it's very traumatizing to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the day and age of school shootings, definitely traumatizing at the minimum. Mm-hmm. The kids that I spoke with, first thing I asked them was, are you okay? How are you doing? Mm-hmm. And they said they were fine, but you could still see that they were kind of struggling a little bit.
What a sense of uneasiness that you would have if your school went on lockdown and you're thinking the worst, and then to find out that it's somebody's twisted idea of a joke.
Yeah, it's terrible that our kids have to deal with that today.
Well, we'll wait and see if the legislature perhaps does take this up. The tougher penalties we did see, of course, came from a death that occurred I mean, we know in Sedgwick County just how dangerous these calls are. We've had it happen.
Yes.
Well, and this could have been a catastrophe. I mean, it absolutely could have been a catastrophe. 17 schools across the state, everyone mobilizes to come in and make sure kids are okay. That it could have gone, I mean, and really it's remarkable that it didn't, that there wasn't anything, and law enforcement responded well, but it could have been a really bad situation.
Perhaps a kudos for all the training that they've done,
Yes.
where the school districts train with the law enforcement departments and that sort of thing.
And what a stressor to have 17 basically at once across the state. I mean, that's a huge strain on our resources. So.
Well, certainly going to be interesting to see if lawmakers decide to make further changes to the law because of this incident. We know it is something that's been going on around the country, really.
Yeah, it's a very bad situation.
Okay. Well, moving on, the question of legalizing marijuana, whether in part or completely, was one of the biggest topics of discussion at the State House this week, along with accusations that the deck was stacked against any changes. KAKE's Jackson Overstreet explains.
For the second day in a row, 9 senators sat inside this room at the State House for an informational hearing on marijuana legalization. And again, the testimony was largely negative.
I do believe that perhaps one of the biggest threats that we face to the quality of life in Kansas is the proposed legalization of marijuana.
Thursday's session included testimony from both people in the medical field and state law enforcement agencies, who all raised some sort of concern with any potential bill to legalize medical marijuana in the state.
Our position on legalizing marijuana, whether it be medical or recreational or whatever you want to call it, and that is, we have been opposed to this since the first efforts to do this came up.
Near the end of the hearing, Democratic Senator Cindy Holscher brought up the fact that every speaker over the 2 days had been opposed to marijuana laws.
As far as the hearing itself and the process, was this through invitation only? And I'm curious when we're hearing from proponents.
The committee's chair, Republican Mike Thompson, says he invited these speakers specifically because proponents have had the chance to speak in the past at other hearings.
We had a special committee on over this October and December, had 4 different days where there were proponents in that. So this was allowing the side to educate us on some of the negative impacts that we've seen in other states.
Despite the sentiment from these speakers, Holscher says a lot of concerns raised over the last 2 days can be addressed.
I think this is my 4th or 5th information session on the topic, where a lot of these issues and concerns that were brought up have been addressed and answered, and bills drafted accordingly.
In Wichita, Jackson Overstreet, KAKE News on your side.
And I know at the beginning of the session, I spoke with House leadership. What action are we going to see? I'm hearing from a lot of viewers, they want to see marijuana legalized, and House leadership told me, you know what, we've done our part. We passed a bill last year. We have our position statement out there, basically. Now it's up to the Senate. Almost sounds like we're maybe not going to see anything from the Senate at this point. What are you guys hearing?
I would just say, based off of just what we just listened to, I'd say it doesn't look super hopeful to me. What do you think, Jason?
I think it's looking pretty bleak over on the Senate side, which is unfortunate, I think. When it comes to some form of marijuana legalization, I think Kansas is one of 4 states that hasn't done anything. The people are telling us they want this, and the irony in the whole discussion around marijuana is that we have a lot of people, particularly in the Senate side, who talk all the time about how they love freedom and they want to deregulate things, and yet they are exclusively the people standing in the way of modernizing these laws. People are very, very clear about this. They want this legal. We're surrounded on 3 sides by it. I also think that we have to start thinking about this in terms of workforce. We hear a lot of conversations about the shortage of workers. Kansas is hemorrhaging people all the time. If you think that people aren't moving to Colorado, Oklahoma, and Missouri because the laws are less restrictive there, you would be mistaken. We are losing resources, we're losing people because of the choices we're making in this state.
Well, of course, you live in a more Democratic district. I hear from viewers all over the state who definitely are saying, when is this going to be legalized? I want this. But your district is more Republican. Are you hearing the same things?
Well, I hear a mixed bag, actually. I hear quite a bit of support for medical marijuana, with making sure that it's regulated in a safe way. I hear a lot of concerns about the fact that we don't have good DUI testing in regards to marijuana, and so that's of concern to a lot of people. So that and then I, of course, have a lot of people who are also against marijuana and recreational marijuana in particular. So just yesterday, I attended a working lunch and just listened to some arguments for both sides, both proponents and opponents of marijuana. And some of them from like Oklahoma, for example. Oklahoma is really, really struggling with their laws currently, and it's really out of control. And they are having a hard time managing the lots of issues that are going on, and it's a huge, huge strain on their law enforcement currently. So whatever we do, it needs to be very thoughtful. It needs to be very well thought out. And you know, Kansas is traditionally, we move slowly. We don't let ourselves be pressured by those around us necessarily, and some of that might be good, some of it may be bad, but you know, I think everyone agrees that taking the time to do something and do it well, or the best we can, is never a bad thing.
I've got to say, as an observer, it kind of feels like the whole sports betting debate that was going on. I hear from the public, they want it, they want it, they want it. Lawmakers are saying we've got to take our time, and session after session after session passes and nothing changes.
I mean, I think Kansas has studied it. We've got a lot of states that have provided data points for us to look at. We can study it until we're dead last, and then we'll have it forced upon us effectively. Another fear that I have, and I think that there's been some comments come from the Senate, is a desire to limit it to some pill form. And I don't like that at all. It feels to me as if we're going to enrich a pharmaceutical company for a product that could be available and could actually generate some revenue and generate some economic activity in the state. I know that it's not universally popular legalization, but in Colorado, Missouri, some of those states, it creates secondary jobs. Marketing, botanists get hired, packagers. There's all sorts of things that come along with creating and allowing a new industry. I think Kansas is really hurting itself by not allowing this to happen.
All right, any last thoughts?
I'll just add, you know, it's an interesting thing with our culture in general that, you know, we are so anti-tobacco smoking and we're so anti-vaping, which is, you know, mostly nicotine, and which is kind of like caffeine actually. It's not in and of itself a carcinogen, but we are willing to consider smoking marijuana, and so it's just kind of an interesting hypocrisy to me that I'm not quite sure what I think about that. So it just doesn't seem quite logically consistent. I guess is how I would say that.
Well, we are human beings, and we're not necessarily logical creatures. Meanwhile, abortion hasn't been a major topic at the State House this year, at least so far, after leadership quietly nixed a proposed ban on abortions starting at 15 weeks of gestation. But it's not entirely absent either, with abortion foes taking to the streets this week to push for bigger changes. The Associated Press reports key players at the State House are focusing on small changes to abortion laws in the wake of last summer's abortion amendment defeat. Among the proposals getting attention, an income tax credit for donors to emergency pregnancy centers that discourage abortions, a ban on telemedicine abortions, and a medical malpractice bill. Abortion rights supporters argue even those limited changes would defy the will of voters. These extreme legislators think they know better than us what our families need to stay safe and healthy, said Ashley All, the main spokesperson for the campaign against the abortion amendment last summer. But abortion opponents say that vote didn't preclude adding new restrictions. Meanwhile, an anti-abortion group called Abolitionists Rising is in Wichita this weekend for a conference opposing all abortions. They took to the streets on Thursday demanding a complete ban on abortion and have been passing out some 50,000 pamphlets and flyers in neighborhoods and parking lots, saying Kansas is awash with the blood of innocent children. And noticing, you know, extreme views, extreme lawmakers awash in the blood of innocent children. This is something that really generates very passionate language, very passionate feelings on one side or the other. It doesn't feel like there's much room for compromise between the two different sides, and yet the majority of Americans, the majority of Kansans have said they're somewhere in the middle on this issue.
I think one of the problems when it comes to abortion and reproductive rights is that the conversation, we're not having the conversations we need to have about what Kansas really wants to see. It's largely steeped in rhetoric, and you saw that from the example of the video. It's over-the-top rhetoric, and I understand that people are passionate about that, but these conversations seem to be happening in the extremes, and to some degree we're not having honest conversations. We're not always getting honest information about what's happening, why people have abortions, why they seek reproductive care. And I think until we take this out of the political sphere and quit trying to use it as a tool to win elections, I think it's going to continue to be an issue that we fight about, because we're not actually trying to solve any problems. We're having this conversation largely in a political sphere, and I don't think it's healthy.
Talking about having the conversation in the political sphere, are you hearing about this from leadership, from other lawmakers?
Actually, it's been fairly quiet. There has been some, there's some legislation that has been talked about. I think it's in various stages of play. I have not actually heard any, what the intentions of leadership are on this topic, particularly in the House, and I really know nothing in the Senate on that one, but I know that it is a very complicated issue, and there are definite real extremes. And I know, talking to my constituents, there are a lot of complicated issues with this, just like there are many issues that we would all love to solve. There's not easy to flip a switch and decide, it's not a one-size-fits-all quick solution. So it will be interesting to see if anything moves on the pro-life issue. I don't know. I have not actually heard anything yet this session. So
I agree. It does feel on the House side we're not having a lot of conversations on the House side about it. So I would anticipate if we see anything, it comes from the Senate.
Well, we do know the Senate is a little bit to the right of the House at this point.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. All right. Well, another fight brewing at the State House is over a flat tax proposal. The Senate has approved a flat tax bill that would apply a universal 4.75% income tax rate to all Kansans, replacing the state's current tiered system of income taxes. Analysts at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy say the flat rate would save the state's lowest wage earners $1 in taxes, while the top 20% of wage earners would get about 70% of the $746 million tax cut. The governor this week warned the plan would damage the state's credit rating, at the same time announcing that rating has improved yet again under her administration. S&P Global changed Kansas' credit outlook from stable to positive, saying Laura Kelly's recommended budgets for fiscal years 2023 and 24 could lead to another rating upgrade, but warning tax cuts like the flat tax proposal could cause the rating to fall back down again. So what do you think, this flat tax proposal? Once again, something coming out of the Senate. Much chance of passing in the House? Have you heard chatter about it yet?
It's on my side, it's been pretty quiet so far. I know I've heard from some constituents that have a lot of questions and concerns, and I think legit questions and concerns about how this is practically going to work, and especially in regards to cutting the food tax. Food sales tax, I should say, and also, there's a lot of discussion and I think movement on changing the cap on Social Security income tax, and so to add a potentially third change to our taxes, that's a lot of changes very quickly, and so, I am personally definitely still in the asking a lot of questions phase personally. So. How about you, Jason?
Well, when it comes to this flat tax, it would be laughable if it wasn't so sad. In my district, which doesn't have a lot of wealthy people in it, they're not talking about income tax. They're talking about property tax. They're talking about being taxed out of their homes. They're talking about sales tax. Income tax is not at the fore of their minds. Rich people care about reducing their income tax burden. Most of Kansas doesn't. I think if we actually wanted to help the working people of Kansas, most families in Kansas, we could do a number of other things. Helping with property tax would be chief among them. If we really wanted to get inventive, we would recouple with the federal standard deduction, which we decoupled from in the 1980s because we didn't like and didn't think we could afford the indexing for inflation every year. So right now, you have a married couple in Kansas who gets a standard deduction of $8,000, where the federal standard deduction is $25,900. That would do a lot more at the bottom end of the income bracket to help people than an inventive flat tax that's going to raise taxes on people on the bottom and lower it significantly on people in the top.
So what do you think is kind of the preferred position of the House from your feelings of it at this point when it comes to any tax changes?
There's been some conversation of a more modest. I think there was a version out there that did have a flat tax but exempted income up to $30,000. This doesn't do this. If you make $10,450, you're going to pay the same tax as somebody who makes $3 million. I don't see in what world we live in where that's equitable. But I think the version that was in the House at least had an exemption. But I think they got away from that because that had like a $1.5 billion fiscal note. So it appears that the solution to that was to take away the benefit to people who make under $30,000.
I think this is once again going to be very potentially where we see some difference between the House and the Senate, and it will be very interesting to see how it plays out. Because right now, I'm not feeling or hearing any vibes, actually one way or the other. So I think people have been more focused on some other issues in the House, and we shall see. But it will be interesting.
It could be real interesting at conference committee time.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Very strong possibility of a few #KSLedge after midnight sessions. Well, we have one last thing to look at. A couple of headlines hitting newspapers Friday morning, the day that we record this episode. One, GOP senators ban oaths or promises on diversity, equity, and inclusion at Kansas public universities. The other one, Kansas lawmakers weigh ban on outdoor sleeping camping as homeless advocates decry the bill. These are a couple of pretty eye-catching headlines. One at least happening in the Senate, but I know you said you were speaking with some folks on the homeless bill.
Yeah, when I saw that there was a bill effectively criminalizing homelessness, I asked to have the sponsors of that bill come into my office. And it's an out-of-state outfit called the Cicero Institute that's pushing this. They come from Texas, and I'll never understand why these out-of-state groups have such an interest in changing policy in Kansas. But this bill should, and I hope, goes nowhere because it is criminalizing being homeless. You're basically kicking people who can't be kicked anymore. But it also takes away a city's authority to manage the problem as they see fit, and it has a mechanism that if they don't follow some of the provisions of the bill, they lose funding to address homelessness if they have a higher than average per capita homeless rate. So you're basically taking a city that has a bigger issue than other cities in Kansas and removing the resources that they would use to lower that rate. I just think it's inhumane and cruel, and I'll never understand why there are groups that are well-heeled and have plenty of money, why they somehow find sport in harming the poorest people in our state.
Have you had any connection with either of these bills? Had talks with anybody or anything?
I can just tell you that I sat in for 2 hours as Vice Chair of Welfare Reform. We sat there for 2 hours and listened to the hearing on this bill. So I am intimately acquainted. So it was a packed house, and I walked in the room and thought, I hope everybody wore their deodorant today, and where's the control for the AC, because we might want to turn it down. So we did hear from the Cicero Institute, I think it is, and then I think we had 25 in-person opponents plus some on WebEx and a bunch of written. So it, I think it is always good to remember that this is just a hearing. Doesn't mean that it will go anywhere. I have heard enough already to tell you that if it was to go anywhere, there would be drastic changes to the bill as it's currently written. I'm not sure it will go anywhere at all. And I will just say, as someone with immediate family members who have been homeless, and it was a battle for our whole family to try to get a loved one through that and into a stable situation, is something that I personally take very seriously, and I know that so do the other committee members. And there's a lot of questions and a lot of concerns, but I will also qualify it by saying not being on the streets is one of the most dangerous places for people to be. My loved one was raped, beat up, sex trafficked, all those things on the streets. So is there a balance somewhere? Can we do better? I know as we are, in Kansas, we are very focused on mental health and how to address that, and like working on our mental health hospital here for Sedgwick County, and those kinds of things. But there's usually a multi-pronged approach to how we help people. Is good to at least consider and at least talk about, and we need to have hard conversations. And in my viewpoint, this was a hard conversation that needed to be had. And I did directly ask the representative from Cicero what motivated them to get involved in this, and go around and, suggest this kind of legislation. And they did just explain from personal experience that they had, in living in multiple different states, that had some real serious issues, such as in California and places like that, that they started digging into to try to help solve some of the issues, and they got passionate about it along the way. So whether it's the right fit for Kansas, and we will see. But I think it may go absolutely nowhere. And I think even if it was to come out of committee, it would not come out without big changes.
Well, and talking about big changes, one aspect of it that particularly caught my eye, and you kind of mentioned it, is the point where it would take money away from cities that have a higher than average number of homeless residents. And we know Wichita is one of those. In fact, we know that other cities actually send their homeless to Wichita because we have more services which are basically overloaded.
Well, I think that's a good point, and one of the conversations I had with the sponsors and proponents of the bill was exactly that. Not every community is going to have the resources available to handle that. A lot of communities, the jail has become the de facto mental health center because we have historically not invested enough in mental health. We haven't expanded Medicaid, so what we see is people they get arrested, they get to jail, they get stabilized, they get on medication, they're released from jail, they have no medical resources available to them, and then they destabilize and fall back.
All right, we're going to have to let that be the last word of the day. Leah, Jason, thank you both so much for joining us this week. We'd also like to thank our news partners at the Wichita Eagle, KSN News, and Cake News for sharing their materials with us. We'd love to continue this discussion with you online. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV or PBS Kansas on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. For now, stay safe and have a great week.